Hello, and welcome to Sunday at the Met. I'm Mia Feynman, curator of photography here at the Metropolitan and organizer of the exhibition, Faking It, Manipulated Photography Before Photoshop. Now, digital technology has made us all much more aware of the degree to which photographs can be manipulated. But in fact, photographers have been altering the camera image from the very beginning of the medium. The exhibition, Faking It, traces the history of manipulated photography from the 1840s, shortly after the medium was invented, through the early 1990s, when the computer replaced manual techniques as the dominant means of altering photographic images. The story continues across the hall in the companion exhibition after Photoshop, Manipulated Photography in the Digital Age, which brings together work by artists who use tools like Photoshop to alter the camera image in their art. And what I hope that viewers will take away from both of these shows is that today's digitally manipulated images are part of a continuum that extends back to photography's earliest decades. This afternoon, we have three excellent speakers whose expertise in photographic manipulation extends from the 19th century all the way to today, to really, this moment. Mark Osterman, an artist and specialist in 19th century processes, will talk to us about how this was done at the very dawn of the medium and how he continues to revive these techniques today. Jerry Uelsman, an artist whose dreamlike compositions have anticipated Photoshop by decades and whose work is in the exhibition upstairs, will talk about his work. And Amy Dresser, a celebrated digital photo retoucher and illustrator, will bring us up to the present and talk about how she transforms images in magazines and advertisements and films in all different ways that we are probably familiar with, although we don't know how exactly it's done. So each of these speakers is going to do a 20-minute presentation. I'll come up and be introducing each of them as we move along. And then at the end, we're going to have a brief discussion, a conversation about how we can think about this in the broader way, looking at manipulation today and earlier in the 19th and 20th centuries. So first, I'd like to introduce Mark Osterman. For the past 12 years, he served as process historian for the conservation department at George Eastman House, International Museum of Photography and Film in Rochester, New York. His primary research in the early technical evolution of photography is internationally recognized by the conservation and fine arts communities, and his images made with historic processes are in major private and public collections throughout the world. Osterman has influenced many artists who are using early processes, including Chuck Close, Sally Mann, Adam Foose, Emmett Gowan, and many others. And his own work is represented in galleries in New York, and the Howard Greenberg Gallery, and a Tilt Gallery in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, today, Mr. Osterman is going to show us why photographic fakery is such an enticing path to take with a medium that inherently bears very little visual truth. I think you'll enjoy his presentation, which includes rare images from the George Eastman House collection and some examples of his own work that feature ghost imagery and other photographic mischief. So please join me in welcoming Mark Osterman.
Oh, thank you. Well, welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Mia. Actually, when Mia said that she was going to curate a show on photographic fakery, my first reaction was, so what? Fakery's been around for a long time, and actually there's nothing very truthful about photography. It's inherently not truthful. And I guess what I mean is that And actually, hearing her speak now, I was thinking maybe I should just change my talk completely around. Where's the button here to do that? There is no truth inherent in the photographic process, so that by the time humans start to fake it, you're already 3 levels away from reality. So let me show you some examples. And I guess what I have to do is start you out by by starting to think about where you would be if you'd never seen a photograph before. This is an example of a dessin fumé. It's a dessin fumé by Daguerre, considered one of the inventors of photography. This is what Daguerre sent to Niepce, Nicéphore Niepce, when he wanted to do a collaboration. He heard that this man Niepce was doing something that was based on light, that was something that was different than drawing. It was special. Well, this is what Daguerre sent as his example of something that was made with light. It's made with smoke. It's a smoke and mirrors. It's actually a watercolor with graphite, which is then smoked with soot, gently rubbed away, and then smoked with soot again, and then gently rubbed away. And it has nothing to do with light. So we might even consider it the first fake. It's a fake of a photograph of an era where there are no photographs. So if you don't know what a photograph is, maybe this will pass. But soon enough, people realize that there are chemicals that will change when struck by light. And so here's an example of something that would have been done by Wedgwood around 1801 or 1802, may have been done by Niepce, maybe Hercule Florence in Brazil. All the inventors of photography made this kind of an image. It's a photogram made with silver nitrate on paper. And of course, we have a botanical on top of the paper. And as light exposes that paper, it turns dark. And when you remove the fern, you get kind of a reverse silhouette. Now, there's nothing truthful about this. If it were truthful, you would end up with a green image against a white ground. So it's inherently untruthful. It is the opposite of what you want. And of course, the people that were making these wanted to end up with something like what they had. They wanted a reproduction of what they had. And of course, the other problem is that eventually they darken, and you lose it completely. Now, when Talbot came around, William Henry Fox Talbot started to experiment with that same process around 1835 at Laycock Abbey in England. And he made images with botanicals and pieces of lace, and eventually he put them into cameras like this. This is actually a camera wedged into the cloisters at Laycock Abbey, where Talbot did his own experiments. And this is what happens. Light comes in through the lens. I have a pointer here. Light comes in through the lens and projects an upside-down and backwards image on the sensitive paper, the same paper that you saw the fern represented on. And the process is so slow that you actually take the cork off the front of the camera and look in to focus the image. If you leave it long enough, and when I mean long enough, you need at least 2 hours in the sun, maybe 4 to 6 hours, you get an image. And this is what it looks like. It's like opening up a geode. You crack open the geode and see what you find. This is after maybe 4 hours exposure at Laycock Abbey, and you open it up and there it is. How great, how wonderful, how disappointing. It's great and wonderful. You've never seen one of these things before, done by a Lilliputian artist. It's pretty accurate, except it's backwards. It's going the wrong direction, and the light things are dark and the dark things are light. Those of us who are old enough to know what a negative is recognize that as a negative. Let me tell you, there are people now who don't know what a negative is, because digital imaging does not require a negative. For many years, we thought of Talbot as the father of photography because he invented the negative. Now the negative is obsolete. You don't need a negative with digital. And so when you get something like this, you're really excited, but you're pretty disappointed too, because you want a picture of that abbey and you want it to be right reading. So that same object, I'll go back again, that same object, Talbot was able to keep. It didn't fade, it didn't darken. He put it into a chemical which also changed its color. Notice how it's a yellow ground with kind of a reddish image. And so there we have the negative of Laycock Abbey. And then, of course, he realized that if you take that negative and put it in contact with a second sheet of sensitive paper and shine light. Of course, I have these separated so you can see the two, but they would be together. And shine light upon that negative, you will then get a positive image. And so there you go. There's the positive image, and he kept it from fading by putting it in another chemical, which changed it this wonderful kind of a mauve color, bluish color, and a brownish red color. Now, is that a good representation? Is that the truth? Is that the truth of this image? Well, that's what the place really looks like. And that, in fact, that's taken from the same viewpoint as that camera. Let's go back again. You know, it's pretty good. However, it has that strange color. There is no focus. It's bent. It's a photographic truth. It's a different kind of a truth. There's a photographic truth that is the medium. There is a truth that the photographer wants you to feel when the photographer artist makes an image, and then there is your own truth. How do you look at these things? How do several blind men describe an elephant? Everyone has their own truth. Another by Talbot. Again, look at the colors. You know, when you think of 19th century photography, you don't think about these colors. You think that everything is brown, don't you? It's kind of like Henry Ford and the black Model T. Well, let me tell you, before the Model T Ford, there was a Model R and there was a Model S, and they all had colors. And so there's another piece by Talbot, and by this time he's invented a process called the catalogue negative, much faster, but he's still making his prints with this stabilized process that gives these wonderful colors. He found it necessary in his book, The Pencil of Nature, to remind you that these things are done by photography and not by the artist's pencil. He was telling you that that's his truth. And in the 19th century, they thought of photography as this mindless eye, something that you didn't need any skill. Well, people still feel that way today sometimes when they talk about photography, that it's just a machine. Here's an example of a daguerreotype. Now, it's not any kind of daguerreotype you've ever seen. I would guarantee it. This is the way the daguerreotype was made when Daguerre was experimenting. The plate was left in the camera. When pulled out of the camera, there was a fully formed image, none of the mercury you hear about. That's what you got. It was a negative. When he wiped it off and then re-exposed it, turned into a positive. That's a strange truth. There are no villages that are green like that. And worse, it's backwards. It's a different kind of truth. Herschel invented a process called the cyanotype. So in this case, he's made an image from laying an engraving upon sensitive paper, and when he was done, he got a blue image. It's a blue truth. Wait a minute, that's like Bluetooth. No. Blue. It's a blue truth, and it's backwards. So it's backwards and blue. Okay, well, enter Robert Hunt around the same time in the 1840s. Robert Hunt, actually 3940, right around there, Robert Hunt invents a direct positive process. So now when you put a leaf on top of the sensitive paper, it doesn't leave a white image below. It reverses and goes dark. But that flower wasn't red. I have a good example. There's one that I made with that same camera of George Eastman House. It's a direct positive process, and the image is red and orange. In fact, again, these are all images made using processes before 1842, and photography was pretty colorful before it ended up being just brown. And so we settle upon the salted paper print by Fox Talbot, and it's a process that gives you a brownish image. Here's another example by Hill and Adamson, a salted paper print, and this is what we expect to see when we think of 19th century photography. With the exception of the daguerreotype. Here is a daguerreotype of Daguerre, and we get a better sense of the real person, but remember, a daguerreotype is always backwards. So if you look at a daguerreotype of yourself, you're not looking at yourself the way others see you, you look at yourself the way you see yourself in the mirror. Very different. Think of every photograph that you had of yourself was how you saw yourself in the mirror rather than how other people see you. It's a completely different truth. And technically, the processes have their own chemical truth. So this is a spectrum, of course. Photography is inherently sensitive to this range right about, well, actually, let me go back to here and up to about there. It's sensitive to UV radiation, which you can't see, and it's sensitive to violet and blue, and that is it. You have to go through hoops to make it sensitive to other colors. And so here's a great example. Rather than a color wheel, here's a metaphor for just about every photograph you could think of. And what I want you to notice is the lemon, the apple, the tomato, the orange, the blue vase, and this tablecloth, which is a metaphor for sky and clouds. The same image taken with the wet collodion process, popular from the 1850s to the 1880s, that's what you get. This is why you don't get clouds and skies of 19th century pictures unless they're faked. This is why blue eyes go white and make people look like wolves. And you can see that if you look at a photograph and say, oh, this is a picture of a woman in mourning, she's wearing black, well, guess what? She could be wearing orange. You look at historic photographs very differently. And of course, they understood this. In fact, there was a time when people were faking money by taking photographs of money and printing them with kind of a bluish-brown color and trying to pass them. And so they ended up with something called the anti-photographic note. This way, all of the red photographs black, and that includes all these little squigglies all through the background, so the whole thing photographs as black. Those darn photographers, those schnickel-fritz. Here's an example of a glass negative that appears as if it has clouds. That Osterman, he's lying to us. No, there are clouds, but they're on the back of the plate. This is the back of the plate with tissue paper and graphite and charcoal. So handmade clouds. In most cases, though, what they would do is actually paint out the sky completely. Since you don't get clouds, then why have a ground where you see all the streaks and marks and drips and things? And so what they would do is just paint out the sky completely. And that's what happens in the case of this Carlton Watkins print that is on display in the exhibit. The sky has been painted out. It's been painted out because who knows what was in that sky? A scratch or two, some bug that did the two-step on the plate while it was still wet. And then he printed in a second negative to make the sky. If you take a picture with a blue sensitive plate of a sky that's pink late in the day, you get clouds. And so now they print the bottom part of the picture with one plate and the top part of the picture with another. And it goes something like this. This is a wet collodion image that I made in Rochester, New York, and my intern let the plate dry out. And so it peeled. Not only did it peel, but it took two buildings with it. Up in the sky, there are some markings from the collodion process that don't really contribute to the picture. So what I did was to paint out the sky, and I shortened the buildings a little bit. Remember, there's a photographic truth. Now you're going to look at all your photographs differently, aren't you? Now, I printed out really a plain sky. I added a little bit of tint to the top because just having a white sky isn't very convincing. And then this was for a demonstration. I went a little crazy. I got a piece of tissue paper and some graphite and smudged some negative clouds on the paper, placed it on top of the same print, and printed in a stormy sky in Rochester. The same thing by George Bernard in the American Civil War, documenting how processes work. Here we have the same sky 100 miles away from another picture. And of course, photographers were quick to realize that these sort of things happen with portraits as well. And how do you create a new sensibility for portrait? Well, you can isolate the subject. Unfortunately, this color-blind film isn't so great for portraiture, so what they would do is they would retouch. There's a woman retouching the negative as her husband is taking the photograph. Sometimes that meant a smudge here or there. Some people needed more retouching than others. They look pretty good when you look at them from a distance, and if you look close up, I always wondered why my great-grandfather had such strange skin. Another piece in the collection, the technique of making that. The act of carving away parts of the negative and adding parts. Photographic surgery. You have a wall-eyed, not really cross-eyed, wall-eyed. In this case, the subject has actually moved, if you look at the 10-finger hand on the right, which was a mistake, but now people start to play with that. What if? Clouds turn into spirits. One of my favorite pieces by Raylander, where you have multiple images in the same image. This is actually a self-portrait. I used to do traveling medicine shows. That's another story. But this is a picture of me on the right with slow film and moving during the exposure back in the 1970s. Eventually, I started using historic process, and this is an albumin print from a wet collodion negative with multiple imagery, but just the same exposure, just moving around the plate during the exposure. That's me in 3 places. So really continuous exposures on the same plate within the camera, not afterwards, but while the exposure is happening. Doing a treatment on my own head. Something like this, which is called blowing smoke, which is exactly what I'm doing on the podium today. In this case, blowing smoke was made like this. Cap is removed. There is the phonograph horn that's being photographed. Let me go back to that. Cap is removed. I position in 3 or 4 positions during the 2-minute exposure. And then to make the smoke, I move tinfoil around. Another piece that gives the impression of me giving a pitch, a medicine show pitch by gaslight, a memory of a dream maybe. And in this particular case, if you look at the setup, there is no flame here. I went back afterwards during the exposure with a piece of tinfoil on the end of a rod and moved it around the image. My audience is just a hat and a coat placed in front of the camera. And then there's the manipulated photograph after photographing. In this particular case, I'm dusting an image. It's tissue paper on the back of the negative. So there is the negative. It's out of focus because you're looking through the back. This was a combination of, again, twirling something just during the exposure while the plate was being made and then extending it with retouching to produce this. So it's a combination of live, continuous exposure, and after manipulation, which you're going to hear from my favorite photographic Schnickel-Fritz, and that is Jerry Ullsman. And so I would close with this, probably the more honest of the photography that you'll see, and timely. This is the front of my house in Rochester, and the most honest of photography that occurs every year around this time, and that is a frost shadow. The entire roof was covered with frost until the sun came out and burned off the rest and left the most truthful of photography. Thank you.